Velkommen alle sammen. Many have asked about this. Our Norse calendar here bears a resemblance to the common Wicca Wheel of the Year that many of you have seen. Now for years I've made fun of Wicca people, but lately I've stopped doing that because I've met some really good people in that kind of Wicca community, and almost everyone there is looking for something a little bit more. Maybe they started in the Wicca path as a teenager, and as they got older they always wanted to get a bit closer to their ancestors and native religions. Look no further. The Norse and Germanic paganism for most of you guys watching is what your ancestors would have followed in the pre-Christian times. And most of you really feel a calling to learn a little bit more about this. Your Wicca Wheel of the Year, after all, is just a combination of some Celtic and Germanic traditions, but with a few big historical inaccuracies in them. So that's what we're breaking down in this video, and maybe we can help convert a few of you. So, some of you know, but on my website is a blog with this topic explained in more depth, and that's also where you can find our calendar for sale, and a ton of other articles with historical quotes directly from the sources. I want to make this blog the best source for Norse history and religion on the internet, and all these quotes are also posted daily on our Instagram and Facebook for any who want to get the real history, because YouTube is just not reliable anymore, so that's Norse imports on all other platforms. Anyway, the Wicca Wheel of the Year is a relatively modern creation. It's less than a century old. It draws on inspiration from ancient Celtic and Norse traditions, but it was created in the last century from a fixed kind of solar-based framework mainly. Now, the Norse calendar, on the other hand, is historically rooted, every part of it, made by myself and graphic designer Lucas, all based on the historical sources we have from pagan times, some of those sources going back 2,000 years. It's lunar based primarily, but there are for sure solar holidays in there. The two calendars have similarities, which we will go over later on in the video, but the Wiccan calendar, the main difference is it relies more heavily on the Celtic traditions and solar cycles, while the Norse calendar is more authentic, closer to the historical sources, but it's more lunar, and the correct pagan dates from that time I will go into in a minute. But let's start with the history. The Wicca calendar, also known as the Wheel of the Year, this calendar was created quite recently in the mid-20th century. It was popularized in the 1950s by Gerald Gardner, who's often called the founder of Wicca. I'm not a big history person on that, so you guys tell me if I'm incorrect there, but either way, the Wicca Wheel of the Year is a modern framework designed to unify the Wiccan seasonal celebrations. It's divided into 8 Sabbats, which include the solstices, equinoxes, and the midpoints in between them. Roughly, the dates are not exact. The calendar is inspired by some Norse traditions, but mostly Celtic, and there are some other pagan traditions in there as well, borrowing elements to create something cohesive like that. For example, the Samhain on October 31st is based on the Celtic festival, marking the end of harvest and start of winter, and that parallels very closely what is called Vetrnatter in the Norse tradition, winter nights. So although that would be on the full moon, and later I'll go on to the exact dates a bit later, you can see the similarities there. Yule, also celebrated at the winter solstice, reflects the Norse Yule, with its focus on the midwinter feasting and sacrifices. Very, very similar there. Even Celtic festivals like Imbolc and Beltane have close connections to some Norse traditions that we have in the sources, but they're still mainly Celtic things on the Wicca calendar. But here's a key thing. While the Wheel of the Year draws from some historical sources, it doesn't replicate them exactly, and sometimes they are on the complete wrong date. The original Norse pagan Yule, for example, was not on the solstice. It would have been on the full moon in January. So don't get mad at the Wicca people, or don't get mad at Gerald Gardner either, or whoever created that Wiccan calendar because they didn't know any better back then. It's actually only in the past couple decades that it's been agreed upon, and there's started to been some more literature examining the Norse calendar like that by professors and historians that we know this. So you can't blame them for having it wrong, and even still today there are many Norse pagans really clinging on to that belief that Yule is on the solstice, which is incorrect. See my blog post or the video about it for a full explanation. But yeah, let's dive into the Wiccan calendar holidays, also known as the Sabbats. There are 8 in total, dividing the year into equal parts based on the solar cycles. You have Yule, celebrated around the solstice, borrows a lot from the Norse Yule. In the Norse tradition, Yule was all about midwinter feasting, sacrifices, and honoring gods like Odin and Freyr, while Wicca keeps the themes like returning to light and rebirth and that kind of thing. But like I said, Yule was not originally tied to the solstice. It was put there in the 1600s, actually, is the first time we have sources of that. But before that, during pagan times, it would have been in January. Ostara, the spring equinox, named after the Germanic goddess of fertility. Although we don't have much about Eostre from the Viking Age sources, there were similar springtime rituals for planning and fertility that existed in the Germanic cultures like Anglo-Saxon England, so Ostara or Estre is definitely a historical Germanic holiday. That is basically the main two, Yule and Ostara, that are clear 100% Germanic holidays on the Wiccan calendar. Then we have Imbolc, Celtic festival honoring the goddess of fertility and healing. While there's no direct Norse equivalent, they were definitely in the Norse world during pagan times fertility rites in the spring, and some scholars link this to the sacrificial rites at Uppsala, recorded in the 11th century, but that's a bit of a fuzzy connection. Then we have Beltane, or May Day, as we used to call it. That might be in parallel to what is called Sigeblut in the Norse sources. It's held in late April, but more likely this is a parallel to the Germanic Walpurgisnacht, which is mainly celebrated in Germany today, but we have some evidence it was celebrated in all the Germanic countries before then. Bonfires, feasting, that type of thing. Litha, the summer solstice, definitely we don't have any Norse sources mentioning that they celebrated the summer solstice, but of course they did. Everybody would have celebrated the summer solstice of these primitive cultures. And we have the Scandinavian Midsommar or Sankthansafton that are celebrated today. Well, we have records of those going back hundreds of years, but definitely have roots in Norse pagan celebrations there as well. Lugnasad, a Celtic harvest festival honoring the god Lugh, who would have been a parallel of Odin. Norse traditions, we don't have. We do have some celebrations like this coming on from later on in time in the folk tradition, but there's no specific equivalent. The Anglo-Saxon Half-Mass or the Norwegian Usluk, they share similarities and are at a similar time, but again, that's mainly a Celtic thing. Maubon, or the autumn equinox, it's also about, the harvest season and all that. The Norse Haustblut possibly occurred during this time, but the Haustblut could have happened at a few different times of year. But I did put the Haustblut on our calendar at that time for a specific reason. And then finally, in the Wicca calendar, we have Samhain, marking the end of the harvest and start of winter. Again, Celtic, but of course we have a almost identical Norse holiday, Vetternætter, which involved ancestor veneration too, feasting and welcoming the winter. So that was 8 Sabbats in the Wicca calendar. The reconstructed Norse calendar, I put 13 holidays on there. So we're going to speak a little bit about that. Unlike the Wiccan calendar, the Norse didn't leave a standardized calendar. We don't know, they don't have any calendars. All we have is a whole bunch of fragmented sources from all over the place, all over Germanic cultures, that we can learn from and kind of connect the dots. Some of the things we do know is that it was specifically centered around the moon. And some of these texts come from really ancient times, 2,000 years ago, archaeological finds, and even folk traditions as recent as a few hundred years ago, but we know that they have pagan roots. Just know that this calendar is, of course, a reconstruction according to my interpretation on the sources. Other historians may reconstruct a calendar like this a little bit differently than I did. But every single part of this calendar and the traditions attached to it are backed by the sources, and every single part of it can be explained from the real history. For example, the Lunar calendar. Roman historian Tacitus wrote in the 1st century about the Germanic peoples following the lunar cycles. He noted that they used the moon to mark time and held assemblies and events based on its cycles. Interestingly, we can only definitively confirm that there were 3 main Norse holidays during the Viking Age, and those appear in the various texts, and they come up repeatedly in various sources in agreement with each other. And those would be the Midwinter, or Yule, celebrated in January-ish time, the Sigeblut, the start of the summer, the Vetternatter, winter nights, marking the start of the winter, and that festival often involves sacrifice and ancestor veneration too. We can speculate about a lot of other holidays that would have been practiced in Norse or Germanic pagan times, like Disablut, or Disting, or Ostara, and these are really the most reliably documented ones. Those 3 and a couple others. But much of what we know about additional celebrations and holidays comes from post-Christianization sources. Even after Christianity spread through Scandinavia, many practices lived on. Seasonal festivals adapted to Christian holidays. They became illegal, the old pagan holidays, but they didn't just disappear, they just adapted to Christianity. For example, winter solstice celebrations, that evolved into Christmas, but traditions like feasting and gift-giving was adapted from Yule, and our Christmas, actually, how we celebrate it today, seems like a hybrid between the solstice traditions that were practiced in Scandinavia at the time, and Yule, which would have been practiced in January. They kind of merged them together, it seems. See my video on that. Spring planting, or fertility traditions. Summer solstice related rituals, something like that. Harvest traditions in the autumn are recorded in Scandinavia too, all starting in the 1500s, 1600s, long after pagan times, but there are plenty of aspects to all those that we can say with confidence have pagan roots. One fascinating survival of Norse timekeeping is the Primstav, and that is a Norwegian calendar stick. There's actually quite a few of them that we found in the archaeology, with the earliest ones dating to the 12th century. It's still a little after pagan times, a couple generations after pagan times, but it bears all the traces of pagan origin there, with markings for the lunar and solar cycles on that Primstav. And we can't forget our very own language. The word for month, even our English word for month, comes from the word moon across many Germanic languages. Old Norse molni, Old English mona, even the Anglo-Saxon monk Bede described lunar-based calendar in the 8th century, tying months to their names and traditions. So when we speak about moons and lunar timekeeping, we're not just speaking about something Norse, we're speaking about all the Germanic peoples here. There's plenty of evidence that all the Germanic peoples followed the same view of the seasons and the year, but of course there would have been regional variations. Now let's talk about some of the similarities and differences. Similarities, they both draw from cycles of nature. Of course, Yule is probably the most significant shared holiday for Wiccans. Yule falls on the winter solstice, while the Norse celebrated Yule a little bit later in January time, but those celebrations are very, very similar. Both calendars recognize the importance of the solstices. In Wicca, it would be Litha, summer solstice, and Yule, winter solstice, 2 of the 8 Sabbats. The Norse sources don't really document a pagan celebration of the solstice, but of course they would have celebrated somehow. We even have a 6th century Greek historian, a traveler, Procopius, who traveled to Thule, which we think is northern Norway, the west coast of northern Norway, and he noted that they had a celebration on the winter solstice. Other than that, the sources come from later times. The equinoxes are also marked on both calendars. In Wicca, the spring equinox is called Ostara, named after the Germanic goddess Ostara again, which there was a celebration for. Also, Adam of Bremen told of a festival at Uppsala around the equinox in the Viking Age, so we think those could have been parallels as well. Finally, Samhain, again, celebrated on October 31st. It's almost identical to the Norse Vetternatter or Winter Nights. It just would have been on slightly different days. The differences, there are definitely more of those. The main one that I see is the New Year's start date for Wiccans. The New Year begins with Yule on the winter solstice. In contrast, the Norse calendar marks the New Year at Vetternatter in October. That's pretty clear from the sources that they viewed October as the start of their New Year. A second one is a solar versus lunar focus. Of course, the Wicca calendar is primarily based on the solar cycles. The Norse calendar would be more lunar based, although they definitely have some evidence that they celebrated the solar cycles too. And then the origins of the holidays. Many Wiccan Sabbats, such as all these here, have clear Celtic roots. We know that it's 90%, 80% based on Celtic tradition, but they share a lot of parallels with the Norse traditions. So that is a very interesting part. Really, the main difference in these calendars, honestly, is the unity that it brings to our communities. Although the Norse calendar is fully historically based, there are always going to be some people crying and wanting to argue to prove who's a bigger nerd and who has read more, or people who have thought they were smart for a very long time and they were doing things wrong and they don't want to admit it. This is the Norse community summed up in a nutshell. Most people fall in one of those two categories. The Wicca calendar, at least we can say that is standardized, and the community seems to be more unifying and not as many people bitching and arguing like we have in the Norse community. This is all a calendar is supposed to be at the end of the day anyway, a unifying aspect of a culture and their traditions. So I hope that the Norse calendar can be that one day, but as of now, Wicca has us beat. They are much more unified. But if you are more of a Wicca practitioner and you would like to learn about the historical religion and traditions of the Norse of Europe, you've come to the right channel. Check out the blog too, and there will be a lot more things coming. But thank you for watching. That's all for today. Vi ses nästa gång.